London, 1881, a city heavy with fog and coal smoke, a living machine whose heart beats beneath the river and whose breath rises from the chimneys. The streets are slick with rain, the gas lamps flicker like half-forgotten prayers, and somewhere in the eastern quarter stands the old monastery of St. Bartholomew, turned now into a hospital where faith and science try to share the same narrow halls. The air inside smells of ether and boiled linen, of ink and rust, of something faintly sweet and wrong that clings to every corner. The walls sweat with dampness, the floors echo with the steady rhythm of footsteps and whispered orders, and in the quiet between those sounds, there lies the true voice of the place, a low constant breathing, as if the building itself were alive, tired and waiting. Among the nurses who move through those dim corridors is Elizabeth Reed, a young woman not yet hardened by habit or hierarchy. She was raised to believe that duty was holy, that the sick must be tended as though they were already halfway to heaven, and that compassion was the first and final law. Her instructors had told her that nursing was an act of faith as much as of skill, that a steady hand and a calm heart could ease the world's pain. But St. Bartholomew's is not a school. It is a proving ground, a place where idealism dissolves like sugar in hot tea. Here the patients come from the streets, dock workers, chimney sweeps, beggars, soldiers returned from wars the newspapers no longer mention, and they arrive already half spent. The nurses are taught to move quickly, to waste neither time nor thought, and to trust their superiors. In this world of order and obedience, the line between care and control is faint, and most have long stopped asking where it lies. Elizabeth learns quickly, but she does not learn easily. There are nights when the fog presses so close to the window that it seems to breathe against the glass, and she lies awake listening to the sounds of the city beyond. Carriage wheels on wet stone, a church bell swallowed by distance, the faint laughter of strangers who are not thinking of death. In those moments she wonders if goodness can survive in a place that smells like this, in halls where each prayer is answered by silence. The head of her ward, Sister Mary Wells, speaks often of mercy. It is her favorite word, spoken with the conviction of a sermon. To her, mercy means quietness, stillness, an end to fear. She tells the younger nurses that the Lord's work is not always bright or gentle, that sometimes his hand must press down rather than lift up. They listen, they nod, and they try not to meet one another's eyes. The doctors come each morning, moving through the ward like judges. Their coats are immaculate, their expressions tired, their language clinical. They speak of progress, of modern technique, of the empire's growing knowledge of the human body. They praise the nurses for their discipline, for the order that keeps this fragile machine running. But behind their words lies something else, something unsaid, a recognition that the science they serve cannot yet cure most of what fills these beds. The instruments gleam, the ledgers are precise, yet still the rooms are full of coughing and prayer. And when night falls, it is not science that stays behind with the dying, but the nurses, the women in white who walk softly through the gaslight with a smell of ether clinging to their hands. Elizabeth begins to notice patterns in the silence. Some patients sleep more soundly than seems possible, others fade more quickly than their conditions would predict. The records are clean, the handwriting never trembles. Sister Mary walks the rows with calm authority, her rosary tucked neatly into her belt, her eyes cool and certain. Mercy, she says, whenever someone questions the peace that comes so swiftly to the ward. Mercy is the highest form of care. And though no one dares to argue, the word itself begins to change shape in Elizabeth's mind. It grows heavy, it casts a shadow. There is talk in the city about the future of medicine, about new discoveries, about reform. The newspapers speak of progress as if it were a kind of salvation, but inside the hospital the air feels older than time, thick with habits that no modern rule can wash away. The nurses joke quietly in the laundry, laugh without joy, weep without sound. They have seen too much, and still they come back, day after day, to wash the same floors and hold the same hands. Elizabeth writes their names into the ledger, one after another, her pen scratching softly in the lamplight. The ink never smudges. The page never runs out of space. She tells herself she believes in mercy, but each time she washes her hands, she scrubs harder, as if something invisible has begun to cling to her skin. The scent of ether does not fade. It seeps into her clothes, her hair, her dreams. At times she imagines the whole city smells of it, the river, the fog, even the cold stone of the churches, and that London itself has become one great ward waiting for a cure that will never come. The days passed in a blur of light and shadow. The fog thickened outside the windows, pressing against the panes like a living curtain, and the bells of St. Paul's seemed to toll from another world. Elizabeth moved through her duties almost by instinct now. Her hands knew the rhythm of the ward better than her thoughts did. Yet, somewhere inside her, a seed of unease had taken root, a small, persistent awareness that something in the air had changed. It was not any single thing that drew her attention, but a pattern that grew too clear to ignore. The way Sister Mary paused before certain beds, her prayer shorter, her glance colder. The way the other nurses avoided those corners of the room, crossing themselves in silence before continuing their work. There was no accusation, no whispered theory, only that quiet and dreadful understanding that mercy, as it was practiced here, had begun to mean something else entirely. Elizabeth tried to speak once. She chose her words carefully, softly, as though she feared the walls might hear. "Sister," she said, "do you think the Lord would ever wish an end to life if there was still hope within it?" The older woman smiled gently, as if the question were that of a child. "Hope is a luxury for the living, my dear. We tend to souls that hover already at the threshold. To ease their passing is to serve both God and them." That night Elizabeth lay awake long after the lamps had been extinguished. The smell of ether clung to her sheets, sweet and sharp. She turned her face to the wall, listening to the slow pulse of the city beyond, and she thought of all the faces that had vanished into that stillness Sister Mary called peace. She wondered if peace could ever be purchased at such a cost. She began to write in secret, first in the margins of her notebooks, then on scraps of paper folded inside her apron. Observations, dates, small details that might otherwise be forgotten. She wrote of the quietness of the ward at night, of the candles that burnt too long beside certain beds, of the entries in the ledger that seemed too neat, too perfect. She did not yet know what she meant to do with those notes, only that writing them made her feel less alone. Outside, London moved on, unaware. The newspapers spoke of invention, of discovery, of progress. They celebrated the triumphs of science, the rise of modern medicine, the coming age of knowledge and light. But in the narrow rooms of St. Bartholomew's, the air grew heavier, more difficult to breathe. The lamps hissed softly. The smell of ether never left. Weeks became months. A new doctor arrived, younger than the rest, with a curiosity that had not yet been dulled by repetition. He asked questions that others avoided, lingered too long at the bedside of those whose eyes were closing. Elizabeth watched him, unsure whether to fear or trust him, until one evening he stopped beside her in the corridor and said, "There are things here that don't fit the records." She met his gaze but said nothing. In the silence that followed, she felt something tighten and then break inside her, as though a cord long stretched had finally snapped. That night she unfolded all her hidden notes and began to copy them neatly onto a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting trembled, but she did not stop. When she finished, she addressed the letter not to a superior, nor to the church, but to a small London newspaper known for publishing uncomfortable truths. She sealed it with wax and pressed her thumb into the warm red surface, leaving the faintest trace of her print behind. Then she set it aside, waiting for the courage that would carry her to the post office at dawn. The next morning, the fog was so dense she could barely see across the courtyard. The stones were slick, the air thick with the smell of rain and gaslight, and the faint sweetness that followed her everywhere. She hesitated only once, then slipped the letter into the box and turned away. No one spoke of it afterward, not directly. But a week later 2 men arrived at the hospital, their coats dark and heavy, their questions polite but sharp. They carried notebooks, and their eyes lingered on every face. Sister Mary was calm, almost serene. "Mercy," she said to them, "is often misunderstood." By the end of the month the visitors were gone, and life at St. Bartholomew's continued as before. Yet Elizabeth could not shake the feeling that something vast and unseen had shifted. The fog seemed thicker, the light dimmer, the silence longer. And though no one ever mentioned the letter again, she began to notice strangers standing in the shadows outside the gate, their hats pulled low, their breath pale in the cold morning air. Years later, when Elizabeth herself had left the city and the old hospital had been rebuilt, the archives would list a series of reforms introduced in the winter of 1882, changes to record-keeping, to ward supervision, to the use of certain substances now deemed ethically questionable. Her name would not appear in those records, nor would Sister Mary's. Only the place remained, the air of it somehow different, though the smell of ether, faint and ghost-like, never truly disappeared. Some nights, long after she had left nursing behind, Elizabeth would wake from dreams in which she was still walking those dim corridors, her lamp trembling in her hand, the silence pressing close around her. She would smell the sweetness of ether, hear the faint rustle of sheets, and feel the weight of that word again, mercy, heavy as a stone, unanswerable as prayer. And when the wind rose and the city's fog crept through the open window, she could almost believe that London itself remembered, that somewhere beneath its endless noise and movement lay the same quiet room, waiting, the air thick with the past, with faith, with forgiveness, and with that lingering, impossible scent. The letter had traveled quietly through the veins of the city, carried by a hand that did not know its weight. It arrived folded within a stack of advertisements and editorials, its wax seal cracked open by a clerk who did not bother to read it in full. But someone did, eventually, in a small office lit by a single gas lamp, where the fog drifted through the open window and turned the air into smoke. The words were not many, but their tone was unmistakable. A nurse from St. Bartholomew's, anonymous but articulate, had written of mercy that did not feel like mercy, of records too perfect, of silence too deep to be holy. It was not an accusation, it was a confession whispered into the dark, and it demanded an answer. Within a week, the paper printed a brief notice, no more than 3 lines long. Under the heading on matters of care, it asked whether certain practices of patient management in London's older hospitals might warrant review. Most readers turned the page without a thought. But for those who had worked behind those walls, who had walked those corridors heavy with ether, the words struck a nerve. By the following Monday, 2 men in black coats stood at the gates of St. Bartholomew's, their boots wet with rain, their expressions calm and unreadable. They carried ledgers and letters of authorization. One introduced himself as Mr. Gray, the other as Mr. Collins. Both spoke softly, almost reverently, as though they had come not to accuse but to understand. Inside, life went on. The wards were clean, the nurses orderly, the doctors dignified. The smell of ether hung, as always, sharp and cold, but no more than usual. Elizabeth moved among the beds with a calm face, though her heart stuttered at the sight of those men. She had not expected them to come. She had not expected, perhaps, that anyone would read her words at all. Yet here they were, and with them came the subtle tremor of change. Sister Mary greeted the visitors herself. She spoke with precision, her voice wrapped in warmth. She showed them the ledgers, the instruments, the rows of beds arranged in mathematical order. Her hands did not shake, her gaze did not waver. "We have nothing to hide," she said, and the words sounded so simple, so certain, that even Elizabeth almost believed them. The men stayed for days. They spoke to nurses, to attendants, even to a few patients. They took notes, measured silences, studied the rhythm of the place. In the evenings they walked the city streets, returning in the mornings with eyes that had learned to look past appearances. And all the while, the air in the hospital seemed to thicken, as though aware of being watched. Elizabeth felt their presence like a hand on her shoulder, comforting at first, then heavy. She answered their questions carefully, avoiding words that might reveal too much. Yet when Mr. Gray asked her whether she believed mercy could ever be misunderstood, she hesitated. "Sometimes," she said, "mercy is only another name for surrender." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment she thought he knew everything, but he only nodded and wrote something in his book. Rumors spread quietly, like dust. Some said the men were government agents. Others whispered they were from the church. The doctors pretended indifference. Though their tempers grew short, Sister Mary's prayers became longer, her eyes harder. "We must hold to our work," she told the nurses, for God tests those he trusts, and they did. Though each night the air seemed colder, the lamps dimmer, the silence sharper. The inquiry's conclusions were neither swift nor decisive. When at last the men departed, they left behind no scandal, no trial, no name in the papers. Only a phrase, certain administrative adjustments recommended. The city forgot within a week. But for those inside the hospital, the aftermath lingered. Some of the older nurses left soon after, claiming illness or family duty. A few new faces arrived, young and uncertain, unaware of the undercurrent that ran beneath the polished floors. Elizabeth stayed. She could not yet tell whether her letter had saved anyone or merely stirred the dust. The fog had returned, heavier than before, and she moved through it as one who walks through a dream. The young doctor, whose curiosity had once made her uneasy, now spoke to her in quiet tones. "There are truths that cannot live in the light," he said one evening, as they stood near the window watching the gas lamps flicker. "Sometimes the best we can do is to open the window and let a little air in." Elizabeth thought of the letter, of the trembling wax, of her own thumbprint pressed into it. "And if the air itself is poisoned?" she asked. He did not answer. Weeks turned to months again. The ward grew quieter. Sister Mary's health began to fail. She coughed often, pale beneath the lamplight, yet refused to rest. The others whispered that she worked herself too hard, that her strength was failing. Elizabeth did not believe it was only that. She noticed how Sister Mary sometimes stared into the distance, as though listening for a sound that no one else could hear. One night, when the fog was thickest and the bells were silent, Elizabeth found her in the chapel, kneeling before the crucifix, her hands clenched around her rosary. "Child," she said without turning, "do you ever wonder whether God grows weary of watching us pretend?" Elizabeth said nothing. "The world is cruel," Sister Mary continued softly, "and mercy is the only language we have left. But perhaps even mercy can rot if it is spoken too often." Her voice trembled then. For the first time, the candlelight flickered against her face, and for an instant she seemed both old and young, both saint and sinner. Elizabeth stepped closer, but the older woman only whispered, "Go now. There are things you should not see." The next morning Sister Mary was gone, her bed untouched, her belongings neatly folded, her name quietly crossed out in the ledger. No one spoke of it openly. The matron said she had been transferred to a convalescent home outside the city, though no such place could be found in the records. Elizabeth did not ask. She knew that silence, once begun, has a gravity of its own. Winter came again, and with it a pale light that never seemed to grow. The hospital continued, the same as always, its heart beating quietly beneath the fog. The smell of ether still drifted through the corridors, faint but constant. And sometimes, when Elizabeth passed the empty chapel, she thought she heard a voice, not words, but a breath, a sigh, a whisper that might have been prayer or warning. She began to write again, though not letters this time. She wrote in a small black notebook, recording details that no one would ever read: the temperature of the wards, the pattern of the lamps, the way the fog seeped beneath the doors. She no longer believed she could change anything, yet the act of writing steadied her hands. Outside, the city moved toward the new century, bright and loud and proud of its progress. But within those stone walls, time seemed to hold its breath, and on some nights when the lamps burned low and the air grew thin, Elizabeth could almost believe that the inquiry had never ended, that it had only gone deeper, quieter, waiting for someone else to open the window again. By the spring of 1883, the inquiry had long since faded into the city's memory, absorbed by newer scandals and quieter triumphs. London had moved on, as it always did, swallowing the past like the river swallowed its own rain. Yet within the walls of St. Bartholomew's, time had not moved at all. The air still carried that faint, sweet scent of ether. The lamps still hissed. The fog still gathered outside the windows, patient and unblinking. Elizabeth Reed remained at her post. She no longer spoke of mercy, or justice, or the nature of goodness. Such words had become heavy in her mouth, dull with overuse. She worked as she had always done, cleanly, quietly, precisely. But something within her had changed, though she could not yet name what it was. There were moments when she caught her reflection in a glass door or a basin of water and failed to recognize the eyes that stared back. In March, a new matron arrived. Her name was Mrs. Harcourt, a woman of 50 with the posture of an officer and the voice of a sermon. She spoke of efficiency, of reputation, of order restored. The hospital was to be modernized, she said, its old ways examined and improved. To Elizabeth, the words sounded both promising and dangerous. Order, she had learned, was a beautiful disguise for many things. The changes came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The ledgers were rewritten, the wards renumbered, the old linen burned. New curtains were hung to separate the beds, and certain rooms unused for years were sealed for renovation. It was said that one of the east corridors was to be converted into a surgical wing, though no one seemed to know who worked there or what precisely was being done behind its doors. Elizabeth avoided that side of the building when she could. The air there felt different, still, too heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Yet on certain nights, when she passed near the stairwell that led to the east wing, she would hear faint sounds, the shuffle of feet, the closing of a door, a murmur that might have been speech or wind. Once, she thought she smelled ether again, stronger than it had been in years, and her hand trembled so that she dropped the lamp she carried. When she asked another nurse about it, the woman only shook her head. "There is no east wing," she said quietly, as though repeating a rule rather than an answer. "Not anymore." But Elizabeth remembered the architecture too well to believe it. She knew the shape of the corridors, the rhythm of the steps between the wards, the places where the stone changed color. She could still trace in her mind the route she had walked so often in her first year the ward. The chapel, the small room beyond the linen stores where Sister Mary had once kept her records. That was where the new doors now stood, painted over, their handles removed. She began to dream of them, night after night. In her dreams she walked through the locked corridor, her lamp trembling, the air thick with the scent of ether and ink. She could hear footsteps ahead, slow and deliberate, and the echo of her own name whispered from somewhere unseen. When she awoke, the smell lingered. It was near midsummer when she decided to see for herself. The night was warm, the city strangely silent. She waited until the last bell had rung, until the wards had gone still. Then she took a small key from the drawer of her desk, a key that no longer fit any known lock, and made her way toward the east corridor. The air grew cooler as she walked. Her lamp flickered, casting long, trembling shadows along the stone. The first door she tried was sealed tight, its hinges rusted. The second yielded slightly, as if the wood remembered movement. Behind it was nothing but darkness and the faint sound of dripping water. She stepped inside, her breath shallow. The smell of ether hit her at once, so strong it burned her throat. There was a table in the center of the room, covered in a sheet that had once been white. Instruments lay arranged beside it, told unused, dust-coated. A ledger rested on a stand nearby, its pages yellowed but neat. The handwriting was familiar. Elizabeth's hands shook as she turned the first page. The entries were dated 1881, 1882, and each line carried a name, a note, a single word beside it. The word was always the same: released. Her stomach turned cold. She turned another page, and another. The ink grew fresher. The final entry bore the date from the week before. There was no name beside it, only a line, drawn with a steady hand, as though waiting to be filled. She closed the book, her heart beating so loudly she feared it would wake the walls. In the silence that followed, she heard something move, a soft step, a sigh, perhaps only the building shifting in its sleep. She turned toward the doorway, and for an instant she thought she saw a figure standing there, a shape, pale and still, the suggestion of a woman's form. The air shimmered around it like heat. Then the lamp guttered, and the shape was gone. Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the dawn creep slowly through the fog, and tried to convince herself that what she had seen was only memory, given shape by fear. Yet when she reached into her pocket, she found the key still warm, and beneath her nails, a trace of dust that smelled faintly, unmistakably, of ether. The next day she went to the matron's office to speak, but Mrs. Harcourt was polite, firm, and dismissive. "There is no such room," she said. "Those areas are sealed. You must be mistaken." Elizabeth wanted to insist, but something in the woman's eyes stopped her. They were calm, practiced, and utterly without surprise. So she nodded and left, her words swallowed by the corridors that had learned to keep secrets better than any person. That evening, as she crossed the courtyard, she saw a young orderly carrying a crate marked for disposal. A corner of something white hung over the edge, a scrap of fabric, stiff with age. For a moment she thought it was linen. Then she saw the faint letters stitched along the hem. SM. She stood frozen until the man disappeared into the fog. From that night onward, she never passed the east wing again. She told herself the room was gone, the ledger burned, the memory sealed away like a wound beneath a bandage. But sometimes, when the wind shifted and the lamps flickered, she could swear she heard the faint creak of a door opening somewhere deep within the walls, and the sound of quiet, careful footsteps returning to work, and the smell, always the smell, came drifting after. The winter of 1884 came early and hard. The fog that year did not lift for weeks, pressing over London like a weight, seeping into every crack of brick and glass, swallowing even the sound of the bells. The hospital stood in it like a ship half sunk, its windows dull, its lamps glowing faintly behind the vapor. Inside, the smell of ether had grown stronger again, though no one spoke of it aloud. They said the new ward was responsible. The Harcourt wing, opened with ceremony and precision, meant to be a symbol of progress. Elizabeth had watched it being built. The carpenters and painters moving like ghosts through the corridors, their hammers muffled, their eyes averted. No one ever saw plans or blueprints. Everything arrived ready-made, as though conjured from the fog. And when at last the wing opened, it appeared overnight, immaculate, almost too perfect. The floors gleamed, the walls were a blinding white, and the air smelled of polish and something faintly metallic. Mrs. Harcourt herself led the nurses through it, explaining the new order. This would be the future of medicine, she said, a place of quiet, control, and efficiency. Yet for all its brightness, the new ward felt strangely cold. The lamps hissed more softly there, the echoes were duller, and the windows, though large, never seemed to show daylight. The patients admitted to the Harcourt wing were of a special kind, cases for observation, as the matron called them, and their records were kept separately, under lock and key. The nurses assigned to those beds rarely spoke during meals, and when they did, their voices carried a practiced lightness, too careful to be natural. Elizabeth herself was not among them. She had been reassigned to the older wards, where the paint peeled and the pipes moaned through the night. She told herself she was grateful, but there were moments when she caught herself looking toward the new wing with something between dread and curiosity. The scent that drifted from its doors was not ether alone now. It carried another note, faint but sharp, like cold iron and candle wax. In December, a young man was transferred from the new ward to hers, a clerk from the docks, barely 20. He was pale, almost translucent, his pulse shallow, his words confused. "They said I was better," he murmured once, but the rooms had no windows, and the lamps never went out. Elizabeth asked him what he meant, but he only smiled faintly and turned his face toward the wall. Within 2 days he was gone and his bed stripped clean. The record of his stay bore no mention of the transfer. The following week, Elizabeth went to the Harcourt wing herself, under the pretense of delivering linens. The corridors there were quiet as tombs. She saw no attendants, only the faint shimmer of light beneath a door at the far end of the hall. As she approached, she felt the temperature drop, the air growing colder, heavier. The smell was unmistakable, ether and iron and something that might have been salt. She hesitated, hand on the handle, then turned it slowly. The room beyond was dim, lit by a single lamp that hung too low, its glass trembling. In the center stood 3 beds, perfectly made, their sheets smooth and untouched. Along the far wall, a series of cabinets gleamed, their locks new and unmarked. There was no sound but her own breathing. She stepped inside, her shoes silent on the tile. On one of the cabinets lay an open book, not a ledger this time, but a register bound in black leather. The ink was fresh. The first line bore a date, November 22nd, 1884. Beside it, a phrase, "Procedure successful, patient transferred." There were no names, only numbers, and beside each number a single word, quiet, stable, unresponsive. Elizabeth felt the air thin around her. She reached out to touch the page, but before her hand could fall, she heard a voice behind her. "Can I help you, Nurse Reed?" She turned. Mrs. Harcourt stood in the doorway, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly before her. "I thought you'd been reassigned to Ward C." Elizabeth opened her mouth, then closed it again. I was bringing linens, ma'am." "Linens?" The matron's smile did not reach her eyes. "There are no patients here yet. You must have taken a wrong turn." Elizabeth nodded quickly, backing toward the door. "Yes, ma'am, of course. Be careful where you wander," Mrs. Harcourt said softly, her gaze holding her like a pin through paper. "These corridors are not all what they seem." Elizabeth left without another word, but that night she dreamed again of the East Wing, the one that no longer existed, and of Sister Mary's voice whispering through the walls. When she woke, her hands smelled faintly of ether. In January, the snow began to fall, thick, silent, unending. The hospital felt smaller somehow, as if the fog had crept inside. 2 of the nurses from the Harcourt wing fell ill, though their symptoms were never described. Another simply stopped appearing for duty. "Resigned," said the matron's notice, though the word looked wrong in her handwriting. Too deliberate, as if chosen to hide another truth, Elizabeth wrote in her notebook each night, though her words had begun to blur together, dreams and waking mixed until she could no longer tell them apart. She wrote of doors that appeared where none had been, of corridors that ended abruptly, of a pulse she could hear in the walls, steady and mechanical. The smell of ether had seeped into everything: her clothes, her hair, even the bread in the ward kitchen. The young doctor, the one who had once spoken of opening windows, came to her one evening with a face pale as marble. "You must leave," he said quietly. "There are things I cannot stop, and they are beginning again." She wanted to ask him what he meant, but he only shook his head. "It's not medicine anymore, Elizabeth. It's something else. They call it progress." The next day he was gone. Transferred, they said, to a new hospital in the north. No one had seen the letter of assignment. February brought with it a strange, restless quiet. The Harcourt wing was closed for refurbishment, its doors locked, the windows boarded from within. The corridors beyond it echoed differently now, the air thicker, the fog heavier. At night Elizabeth thought she could hear faint music coming from behind the sealed doors, not melody, but a single sustained note, like the hum of an unseen machine. One evening, while she was walking back from the laundry, she passed by the old chapel. Its door was ajar. Inside, the candles had burned low, their smoke curling toward the rafters. On the altar lay a folded cloth and a small brass tag engraved with a number 47. She did not touch it. She only stared until the cold drove her away. After that night, the dreams came more vividly. In them she walked through the Harcourt wing again, only now the rooms were full, not of people, but of beds that breathed, their sheets rising and falling as though the air itself had lungs. She would wake with the taste of ether on her tongue, her pulse racing, her throat dry. By March, Elizabeth had stopped speaking of her fears. The nurses who remained were too tired, too cautious, too practiced in silence. The matron spoke rarely now, her voice hoarse, her eyes distant. It was said she was preparing to retire, though no one believed she would leave. The spring thaw came, but the fog did not lift, and on the first day of April a notice appeared on the hospital gate, printed in bold black letters: St. Bartholomew's Hospital to be modernized under new administration. Harcourt wing permanently closed. No explanation followed. The following night Elizabeth walked the courtyard one last time. The lamps were low, the air heavy with mist. From somewhere deep within the hospital, she heard the faint creak of a door opening, then closing again. She paused, listening. The sound came once more, the soft rhythm of footsteps, the whisper of fabric, the echo of work continuing long after the world had turned its eyes elsewhere. She did not follow. She only stood there, her breath visible in the cold, her pulse matching the distant hum, and though she would never speak of it again, she knew that whatever had been done in those white silent rooms had not ended. It had simply moved deeper, beneath the surface of things, into the hidden architecture of the city itself. When she finally left London that summer, She carried with her only one thing, the small black notebook, bound with a strip of ribbon, its pages filled with her steady, meticulous handwriting. She never opened it again. But sometimes, years later, when she passed a hospital or caught the faint scent of ether in the air, she would stop and listen, and if the wind was right, she could still hear the hum, steady and patient, like a heart that refused to die. In the spring of 1937, the city began tearing down what was left of the old St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The newspapers wrote about modernization, about progress and new wings of glass and steel, about the promise of cleaner air and brighter wards. I was there not as a journalist but as a clerk from the records office, sent to collect any papers of historical value before the demolition crews arrived. It was not uncommon. London was remaking itself then, and the old institutions were quietly being erased. The hospital was already half hollow when I first entered it. The floors echoed beneath my steps, and a film of dust lay thick on every railing, every window. The walls smelled faintly of damp stone and something I could not name at first, a sweet, chemical odor that seemed to drift from nowhere. It reminded me, absurdly, of my childhood dentist, though sharper, colder, older, ether perhaps, though I had never smelled it so strongly before. Most of the archives had already been moved, the boxes labeled, the ledgers packed. But in the basement, behind a row of disused cabinets, I found a door that was not on the inventory map. The keyhole had been filled with wax. The hinges were painted over. The paint flaked easily under my knife, and when the door gave way, it did so with a sigh. The air that came out was dry and heavy, as though it had been sealed for decades. Inside was a small room, barely large enough to stand in. There was a single metal table, a broken lamp, and stacks of boxes that had once been blue but were now the color of bone. Each was marked with the same code, HW 1884-1885. I opened one carefully. Inside were medical ledgers, handwritten in a neat looping script. The ink had faded to brown. Most pages carried nothing but numbers, dates, initials, columns of temperature and pulse. But on the inside cover of the first volume, someone had written, faintly, in pencil, "For the record, when records no longer matter." I did not understand it then. Over the following weeks, I brought the boxes back to the records office, catalogued them, cleaned the dust, noted the deterioration. I worked alone in the evenings. The others had no patience for old paper, and fewer still for hospitals. The ledgers unsettled me, though I could not have said why. The writing was calm, methodical, almost tender, but between the lines, between the figures and observations, something pulsed. Every so often a word appeared that did not belong. Stillness, humming, release, ether, and once, on a page near the back, in that same small, careful hand, they say the new ward hums, even when empty. I think it remembers. I thought perhaps the author had been a nurse, perhaps even the matron herself. But as I compared handwriting across the volumes, I found marginal notes in another style, firmer, more formal, bearing the initials MH. These notes referenced Procedure Series 47 and Stability Experiments. I sent a note to my superior at the Home Office Archives asking whether these corresponded to any known research. The reply, weeks later, was brief. No such studies recorded. Destroy or re-archive as non-public medical documentation. I did not destroy them. In the bottom of the last box, beneath the ledgers, was a small notebook tied with a ribbon. The paper inside was thin, nearly transparent, and the ink uneven. The first page began without preamble. To whoever finds this, I have written because silence no longer feels holy. There are rooms here that should not exist, and yet they do. They appear and vanish like breath on glass. The air remembers what we do not. The handwriting matched the pencil inscription from the ledger. I began reading by lamplight. The entries were not dated but moved in fragments, images of corridors, of locked rooms, of the smell of ether growing stronger, of voices in the fog. It read not as confession, nor even as madness, but as observation, stripped bare. There was a calmness that made it worse. One passage stayed with me. They said the wing was progress. But progress has a smell, and it is sweet and cold. The walls listen longer than people do. I think they are learning how to breathe. By the time I reached the final page, The writing had grown faint, hurried. If they close this place, let it sleep. Do not build over it. The ground hums when the wind is still. It will remember us. After that came only a line drawn across the page, as though to end something. I sat for a long time in that office, listening to the low whine of the city outside. When I finally stood, the room felt different, thinner somehow, as if the air had shifted. I could hear the faint hum of the electric lights, the shuffle of paper, my own breathing. But beneath it all, there was something else, a steadier pulse, so low it was almost inaudible. Over the next few months, I tried to trace the name Elizabeth Reed. The hospital staff lists from the 1880s were incomplete, but one document remained, a payroll ledger from 1883. Her name appeared twice, once as nurse, Ward C, and once, a year later, as transferred, H wing. The final column, meant for remarks, had been left blank. There were no further records of her employment, no death certificate, no forwarding address, only that single note, sealed away behind a door no one remembered. When the hospital was finally demolished that summer, I returned one last time to ensure the archives had been cleared. The air outside was warm, the light harsh. Yet, as I stood before the rubble, I thought I could still smell ether in the dust. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to my office and opened the ledger again. I laid the notebook beside it, the faint pencil inscription visible under the lamplight, and then, on impulse I still cannot explain, I held my hand to the page. The paper was cool, but beneath it, I thought I felt a vibration, as if something deep within the fibers was still moving, slow and regular, like a heartbeat beneath skin. I withdrew my hand at once, but the pulse remained in the floorboards, in the distant hum of the lights, in the silence between breaths. I began to hear it everywhere, in the ticking of clocks, in the rumble of the underground, in the quiet spaces between words. I told myself it was imagination, that the stories of the old wards had infected my mind, that the rhythm was nothing but memory finding its echo. But I stopped going to hospitals after that. I even moved my desk away from the wall, because sometimes, when the room was quiet, I thought I could hear breathing on the other side. 2 years later, the archives moved to a new building. The old records, those marked HW 1884 to 1885, were sealed in a separate case. Pending review, I signed the transfer myself. The case was sent to a basement vault and, as far as I know, was never reopened. I retired in 1949, and yet, even now, I sometimes wake in the night with the scent of ether in my lungs, and the memory of a hum that grows louder the longer I listen. I have wondered more than once whether the sound has truly followed me or whether I have simply learned to carry it within. There are moments quiet, half-dreaming, when I think I see her. A figure in a nurse's uniform, standing at the edge of the lamplight, her face half-turned, as though waiting for something. The air seems to bend around her. I never hear her speak, but sometimes, if I stay very still, the humming deepens, and I feel the vibration rise again through the floor, through the desk, through my own heartbeat. And then, just before it stops, I hear a whisper, low and even, from somewhere very near. The air remembers.